The Carnegie Triggers of Return project is something we started almost 2 years ago. It came at a time when we realized that much of the political settlements and discussions around political settlements were happening without taking into account the needs or wants of almost 5 million Syrian refugees who had been forced to flee the country. So the project really focuses on trying to understand through a series of focus group meetings. We conducted 39 focus group meetings in Lebanon and in Jordan to try and understand what are the things that Syrian refugees need to see in place before they are able to go home. And the project itself included Syrian refugees from very different demographic groups, geographies in Syria, but also spread across Lebanese and Jordanian territory. It also included people who were in camps in Jordan and those outside of camps, and in Lebanon, those with valid residency permits, and those not. The number one demand is safety and security. But this sense of safety and security, as we discovered, is tightly correlated with a political transition. In other words, for Syrian refugees to feel safe about going back home, there needs to be some sort of a political transition, which is understandable in their minds. Many of them have fled Syria because of barrel bombs and population transfers and ethnic cleansing and many other instruments that have been used by the regime. So the idea that they would go live under this current regime in this without any kind of guarantees and without any kind of transition is it's very hard to fathom for most of them. What was interesting is even when we presented alternative scenarios, when we talked about if there was reconstruction and rebuilding and therefore some job opportunities but no political change, or if there are services and no political change, repeatedly the reaction of most refugees was it's better for us to remain miserable than to go back to a place where we're not sure if we will be able to survive till the next day and where we have no guarantees whatsoever. So I think this is perhaps the most important and significant finding, is the extent to which a political transition is privileged by refugees, or at least was privileged during the period when we were conducting this specific research. Other findings are related to the importance of changing laws, of the changing legal environment within Syria that also prevents refugees from going back. This includes new housing and property laws that facilitate the expropriation of private property owned by refugees, or the expropriation of informal housing, informal land where there was informal settlements on. These will make it very difficult for refugees to go back. There are other body of laws that include conscription laws that prevent young men from going back. Many of the young men we saw had actually fled Syria because of the conscription laws that would force them into the army and into the battlefront. Many of them would say, we left Syria because we did not want to kill or be killed. So there's a whole panoply of things that I think are very significant. Perhaps the one last finding I will mention is the extent, is what are Syrians seeking? What are the Syrian refugees seeking? When we asked them about what Syria do they see, what Syria would they like to go back to, it was interesting that they used very much words like freedom. So they talked about a just Syria, a free Syria, a territorial united Syria. There's a very clear-cut rejection of a fragmented Syria. They want to go back to Syria that is whole. So they talked about an inclusive Syria. There is no sense that this is a sectarian or ethnic conflict. They talk very much about it as being a political conflict, and they want a politically inclusive Syria should they choose to go back. They may be forced to return, of course, that's always a possibility. But I think this is where the role of the international community comes into play. They need to work very closely with host countries, i.e., Lebanon and Jordan, to make sure that that does not happen. When we talk about countries upholding voluntary return, the right to voluntary return, we need to make sure that it's not just about this is what I was talking about, looking at also what is happening on the other side of the border, i.e., the capacity of people to go home to their areas of origin in view of the vetting mechanisms that are being put in place. I already mentioned the property laws and other things. So there's a whole package addressing what is happening on the other side of the border that would prevent a safe return for refugees, but also working with host countries to make sure that it's not only that they don't expel refugees, but actually they provide a kind of base minimum of a dignified life for them. For this, there needs to be a lot more investment in host countries, mainly Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. I think there's a real danger that the current Syrian regime may use the refugees as a way to bargain with the international community on either reconstruction funding, i.e., saying, I will allow refugees to come back if you will give us funding for reconstruction. It may use them as a bargaining chip in whatever final settlement is being put in place. Uh, the regime itself has repeatedly, in different ways, indicated that it really does not want the refugees to come back. And partly because I think they're an additional burden to it, partly because they think of most of those refugees as having betrayed their country for leaving it. Especially since a lot of them come from what were in these areas that were the hotbed of civil unrest against the regime. So I think that the regime will use them as a bargaining chip in order to maximize whatever gain they can out of them. Already, it's very clear that they don't want them to go back through what I already described as the changes in property laws, vetting mechanisms that are being put in place that don't allow them to go back to their areas of origin, among other things. Not very bright, honestly. It's unfortunate. I don't think that refugees will be able to go back in the medium to long term. They may be forced back, as we mentioned earlier, but I think it will be very unsafe for them, at least based on the information we have today, for them to go back to Syria. They will not be allowed to go back to their areas of origin, from what we can tell. So if they are forced back, they will just be displaced, to other parts of Syria. Unfortunately, for host countries, I think there's still this sense that no, they're going back very soon. We continue hearing this public rhetoric about the war is winding down. In fact, it's not winding down in many ways. I mean, we're seeing this. There are conflicts on the ground that are ongoing and that will go on for some time. So I think for the refugees, unfortunately, the picture doesn't look very bright. They are here. They will be staying for some time to come in host countries. For many of them, they're becoming very desperate, and more and more people are hoping to move to, seek asylum, would like to seek asylum in the West, but they also know their chances of doing so are very slim.